We continue now with our review of a few very important Western sages and saints from the Middle Ages. In part 2, we'll look at Maimonides, Rumi, Aquinas, and Hafez. Written and produced by Thomas Tyseal. Copyright Thomas Tyseal unless otherwise noted. Born in 1138 of the Common Era, 12 years after Ibn Rushd and in the same city of Cordova, but to parents of a different faith, Judaism, Maimonides is arguably the most respected scholar in Judaism. A court physician and philosopher, Maimonides is famous for his commentary on the Mishnah Torah, which is 14 books and over 1,000 chapters. He was the first person to write a systematic code of all Jewish law. Guide for the Perplexed, a treatise for philosophers on complex subjects, treatise on resurrection. Though brilliant, Maimonides was a humble and practical man. In his Guide for the Perplexed, he wrote, "Do not imagine that these most difficult problems can be thoroughly understood by any one of us. This is not the case." He died in 1204 in Egypt. The epitaph on his tombstone reads, "From Moses to Moses, there never arose another like Moses." Maimonides was the first person to introduce articles of faith in Judaism. Belief in the existence of the Creator, who is perfect in every manner of existence and is the primary cause of all that exist. Belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity. Belief in God's non-corporality and that he cannot be affected by any physical occurrences such as movement, rest, or dwelling. Belief in God's eternity. Belief in the imperative to worship God exclusively and no foreign false gods. Belief that God communicates with man through prophecy. Belief in the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, our teacher. Belief in the divine origin of the Torah. Belief in the immutability of the Torah. Belief in God's omniscience and providence. Belief in divine reward and retribution. Belief in the arrival of the Messiah and the Messianic era. Belief in the resurrection of the dead. Well, what do you think? I'm okay with all of it with 4 qualifications. Number 1, God in number 5 must be understood as the God in items 1 through 4, not just a Jewish God. Number 2, given the great prophecies of Isaiah, Micah, and others, I struggle a bit with the primacy of the prophecy of Moses in number 7. I'm okay, however, with the understanding that Moses is unparalleled in forming Jewish identity and in law-giving. Number 3. In number 9, while I agree that a type of immutability can be granted, that immutability exists in a specific time frame. And 4, finally, I think the resurrection of the dead in number 13 requires a non-literal interpretation, as Maimonides explained in his Guide for the Perplexed, and he wrote, "The ultimate good is the life of the intellect after separation from the body." As with Christian and Muslim philosophers before him, Maimonides taught that some passages in the Torah are allegorical. For example, he explained that descriptions of the physicality of God in the Torah are adapted to the mental capacity of the majority of humans who recognize only physical bodies. The Torah speaks in the language of humanity. All these phrases are allegorical. He also noted 7 causes of the inconsistencies and contradictions in Scripture, the third of which is, the passages in question are not all to be taken literally, Some only are to be understood in their literal sense, while in others figurative language is employed, which includes another meaning besides the literal one, or, in the apparently inconsistent passages, figurative language is employed which, if taken literally, would seem to be contradictories or contraries. As you can see, the battle against the universal literal interpretation of Scripture is very old. Here's what Maimonides said about God. Maimonides wrote, "It has also become clear in metaphysics that by our intellects we are unable to attain perfect comprehension of his, God's, existence. May he be exalted. This is due to the perfection of his existence and the deficiency of our intellects. His existence has no causes by which he could be known." Maimonides continued, "It therefore follows that we do not know his knowledge either, nor do we comprehend it in any way, since he is his knowledge and his knowledge is he." As we cannot know God's essence, Maimonides held we can only know God from the effects of divine activity. He wrote, "Every attribute that is found in the books of the deity is therefore an attribute of his action, and not an attribute of his essence." Between our knowledge and his knowledge, Maimonides wrote, there is nothing in common, as there is nothing in common between our essence and his essence. As you've seen, the idea that God's essence cannot be known and that what we can know of God can only be inferred from God's activity is very old. Traces of this idea are found in Aristotle, who differentiated potentiality from actuality. Recall that Aristotle believed that God brings potentiality into actuality. Later, dunamis was understood simply as God's power, both potential and actual, to do things. In either case, we only know God through God's active use of power. Here's what Maimonides said about creation. Maimonides thought that neither an eternal creation nor creation in time out of nothing was demonstrable in the Aristotelian sense of a demonstrable proof. Thus he turned to the biblical account, but thought it should be interpreted in philosophical terms. He believed that God created the world in a free act of creation rather than a necessary emanation, as taught by many Neoplatonists. Existence is thus due to God's graciousness rather than metaphysical necessitation. Revelation is a further act of divine graciousness. This is supported, of course, by Genesis 1:3, which reads, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light," as well as in Psalm 115:3, which says, "Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases." And in the Quran 2:117, which says, "When he decrees a matter, he only says it to it be, and it is." Or in 28:68, where he says, "Your Lord creates what he wills and chooses." Thus, from the Abrahamic perspective, unconscious emanationism is rejected. Borrowing from both Plato and Aristotle, Maimonides had this to say about the form of people. Maimonides referred to a person's individual soul, that is, intellect, as form. He defined form as that which constitutes the essence of a thing, whereby the thing is what it is, the reality of a thing insofar as it is that particular being. In man, that form is the constituent which gives him human perception, and on account of this intellectual perception, the term zelem, image, is employed in the sentences. In the zelem of God, he created him. Maimonides taught that this form is eternal. Transient bodies are only subject to destruction through their substance, matter, and not through their form or essence, nor can the essence of their form be destroyed. In this respect, they are permanent. Continuing, he wrote, "No form remains permanently in a substance. A constant change takes place. One form is taken off and another is put on." And continuing further on, "Whatever form it has, matter, will be disposed to receive another form. It never leaves off moving and casting off the form which it has in order to receive another. It is therefore clear that all corruption, destruction, or defect comes from matter." Further, Maimonides taught, "Man's shortcomings and sins are all due to the substance of the body and not to its form, while all his merits are exclusively due to his form." The knowledge of God, the formation of ideas, the mastery of desire and passion, the distinction between that which is to be chosen and that which is to be rejected, all these man owes to his form. Maimonides had an interesting interpretation of the Adam and Eve story. He observed that Adam disobeyed the commandment that was imposed upon him on account of his intellect, and becoming endowed with the faculty of apprehending generally accepted things, he became absorbed in judging things to be bad or fine. The effect of the sin was to judge things rather than accept their God-given perfection. Thus we became distracted from the truth and from contemplation of the intelligible and concerned ourselves instead with other things and desire. Here's what Maimonides said on how to progress spiritually. In his Guide for the Perplexed, he wrote, "Some consider all wants of the body as shame, disgrace, and defect, to which they are compelled to attend. This is chiefly the case with the sense of touch, which is a disgrace to us according to Aristotle, and which is the cause of our desire for eating, drinking, and sensuality. Intelligent persons must, as much as possible, reduce these wants, guard against them, abstain from speaking of them, discussing them, and attending to them in the company of others. Man must have control over all these desires, reduce them as much as possible, and only retain of them as much as is indispensable. His aim must be the aim of man as man, namely the formation of ideas and nothing else. The best and sublimest among them is the idea which man forms of God, angels, and the rest of creation according to his capacity. Such men are always with God, and of them it is said, 'Ye are princes, and all of you are children of the Most High.' This is man's task and purpose." Maimonides held that a person is immortal, capable of surviving bodily death to the extent that one's intellect is actualized. There are then degrees of immortality and degrees of being protected by providence. Apart from a small number of passages in the prophets, the resurrection of the dead does not figure in the Hebrew Bible. Nevertheless, by the 13th century, it was becoming a more accepted, shared element of Judaism, and as you've seen, Maimonides included it among his 13 principles. The doctrine is in tension with the intellectualistic Aristotelianism of Maimonides' anthropology, and scholarly debate over whether he genuinely accepted the doctrine continues. Here's a few nice quotes from Maimonides. "Every man should view himself as equally balanced, half good and half evil. Likewise, he should see the entire world as half good and half evil. With a single good deed, he will tip the scales for himself and for the entire world to the side of the good. Not only the tribe of Levi was chosen by God, but any human, man or woman, who is spiritually motivated and has the intellectual understanding to set himself aside and stand before God to serve him and minister to him, and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him, removing from his neck the burden of the many plans people pursue, he is sanctified as holy of holies, and God will be his portion and heritage forever. Next in historical succession is a very famous Sufi mystic, Maulana Jalaluddin Muhammad, also known as Rumi, who was born in 1207 at Balkh, a center of learning and commerce in present-day Afghanistan, and died in 1273 in Konya, Turkey. There were important Sufi sages before Rumi, including Abu Yazid Bistami, Al-Junayd of Baghdad, Al-Hallaj, Yahya Sorowardi, Ibn al-Arabi, and as we saw eventually Al-Ghazali, but none whose fame as a Sufi has stretched more into our age than Rumi. Rumi was the son of a leading theologian who was a conservative Sufi master, and thus Rumi was well trained in both Arabic and Persian classics. Rumi's father took his family away from the city of Balkh just ahead of the Mongolian invasion in 1220, which was precipitated by the regional leader's execution of local Mongolian merchants. The family wandered to Baghdad, Mecca, Syria, and eventually Turkey, where they finally settled. After his father's death, one of his father's former students introduced Rumi to more mystical Sufi teachings, which he studied further in Aleppo and Damascus. At about age 38, Rumi met and became infatuated with a dervish known as Shamsuddin Muhammad of Tabriz, generally known simply as Shams, who introduced Rumi to spiritual music, poetry, and dance. Their mystical union inspired much of Rumi's poetry. Rumi seems to have required a spiritual friend to inspire him. After Shams was likely murdered by one of Rumi's sons, Rumi found two other spiritual muses to inspire him. Sufism began in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era as a reaction against the material pursuit of Muslim leaders. Rejecting finery, early Sufis wore the simple, coarse garments favored by the Prophet. The name Sufi comes from this garment. Sufis drew inspiration from the Quran and from the sayings of the Prophet, focusing on God's immanence and the inner meanings of revelation and the feelings these verses engendered. Taking heed of the hadith, the saying of Muhammad, I was a hidden treasure that desired to be known, hence I created creation to know me. Sufis focused on finding God in everything, including themselves, and on expressing this love in rapturous ways. Some Sufis became so rapturous that they were known as drunken Sufis. More conservative ones were called sober Sufis. Developing an emotional infatuation with God was a major spiritual evolution in Islam. Similar movements can be found among Hindus who focused on Atman, among Buddhists whose goal was experiencing nirvana, and among Christians who meditated on Christ's love and compassion. Sufis recognized this oneness of religion thus bringing more spiritual evolution to Islam. As God is unknowable, Sufis taught that the only way to know God is through contrast. For example, light can only be known by darkness, and God's goodness and beauty can only be known by their opposites, ugliness and evil. Negative qualities, Sufis taught, are real only from the human perspective, their purpose being to help us find the true positive reality. This also is an important understanding. Sufis believe that the physical world, with its attributes of space and time, is at the end of a continuum of reality. The other end is incorporeal and outside of space and time. This reality contains universal archetypes, sort of the Platonic forms, and intellectual concepts. Sufis teach that the spiritual world, however, can only be known or inferred from the material world. Sufis believe that the goal of life is to understand that God is the only true reality and that we must find that God within. Indeed, the Quran reads, "Remember, O Prophet, when your Lord said to the angels, 'I am going to create a human being from sounding clay, molded from black mud. So when I have fashioned him and had a spirit of my own creation breathed into him, fall down in prostration to him.' Thus, to live in God, one must die to self, so that, as the Hadith says, God becomes the eye through which one sees, the ear through which one hears, and the arms through which one grasps. In this manner, God becomes, in a sense, incarnate in the believer who then sees, hears, and acts as God would. At death, Sufis believe that all we can show God to prove our worth is how we have incorporated and acted upon God's goodness, as the Hadith reads, "Verily Allah does not look at your appearance or your wealth, but He looks at your hearts and your deeds." Here are some of Rumi's great works. The Divan-i-Shamsi Tabriz. Divan means the collection works of a poet. The Divan-i-Shamsi Tabriz was written after each of Sham's two disappearances, the first in 1246 and the second in 1248. These verses express Rumi's mystical love for Shams, who stood in as a symbol of his love for the unknown God. Rumi's Divan uses three types of poetic forms, and some seem to have been composed while he was dancing. The Masnavi is 6 books of about 25,000 couplets. Rumi began writing it at the age of 54, continuing until he died at the age of 66. The word Masnavi means couplets. The couplets rhyme, though this is often lost in translation. The Masnavi was not written in the normal sense, but was dictated to his disciples and later checked by him for accuracy. It contains stories on many spiritual themes. Signs of the Unseen are 71 lectures and conversations given by Rumi, recorded by his students. It was probably begun about the same time as his Masnavi. The wisdom of Rumi is displayed in full flower through his quotes, a few of which are given on the next pages. Do not feel lonely. The entire universe is inside you. Stop acting so small. You are the universe in ecstatic motion. Set your life on fire. Seek those who fan your flames. Why are you so busy with this or that or good or bad? Pay attention to how things blend. Why think separately of this life and the next, when one is born from the last? Look at your heart. Inside it, you'll find the ocean. Love rests on no foundation. It is an endless ocean with no beginning or end. If you are irritated by every rub, how will your mirror be polished? What you seek is also seeking you. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 of the Common Era, during the lifetime of Rumi, but of course far away. He was the son of a wealthy castle-owning family in Roga Sica, Italy. At the age of 19, he became a Dominican, a newly established order of priests devoted to preaching and learning. He studied in Paris and Cologne before returning to Italy. He's most famous for his Summa Theologia. The Summa generally presents arguments in dialectical form, starting with stating an argument on one side, then presenting the arguments against it, then ending with Aquinas stating his own view. In Aristotelian logic, it's the next best thing to demonstrative proofs. Aquinas died in 1274 at the Fossa Nova Abbey in Italy. A few months earlier, he had written, "All that I have written seems to me like a straw compared to what has now been revealed to me." 3 years after his death, the Bishop of Paris, upset that philosophers were teaching that God could be understood by logic, issued a set of condemnations which included 20 Thomistic propositions. This condemnation badly damaged his reputation. 50 years after his death, however, Aquinas was made a saint, even though no miracles, considered necessary for sainthood, were attributed to him. During the canonization process, a cardinal noted, "There are as many miracles in his life as articles in his Summa." Aquinas did not like Anselm's ontological argument, so he put forth 5 of his own. The first 3 are cosmological arguments. These generally argue that all things in nature depend on something else for their existence. That is, they are contingent, and that something else is God. Here's a summary of the 5 proofs of Aquinas. 1. The argument from motion. Following Aristotle, Aquinas argued that nothing can move itself. Things must be put into motion by something else. That something else is God. 2. The argument from efficient cause. Nothing is the efficient cause of itself. If there is no first cause, there cannot be any ultimate effect. That efficient cause which results in effects is God. 3. The argument considering possibility and necessity. Everything is either necessary, like Aristotle and Ibn Sina's actual existence, or contingent, their potential essences. If everything is contingent, everything cannot always exist, for that which cannot be at some time is not. That which does not exist can begin to exist only through something already existing. That something already existing is God. 4. The argument from gradations. Things and attributes vary in degrees in relation to something most intense. For example, hottest, coldest, biggest, smallest, best, worst, etc. If there were nothing most intensely good, there could be nothing which is good. As there is good, there must be something most intensely good. That something is God. And the argument from design, also known as the teleological argument. Natural bodies without intelligence, like plants, act toward ends. They direct themselves toward the light. As plants have no intelligence, they must be directed or designed to reach that end by a designer. That designer is God. More modern examples of systems that seem designed include the photosynthetic system, the Krebs cycle, and the ratio of charge of an electron to a proton. As with previous Greek and Muslim philosophers, Aquinas argued in his Summa that God must not be material and cannot be a composite. Further, God must be perfect in every way, the highest good, infinite, omnipresent, unchangeable, eternal, one, and possessed of perfect knowledge. Unless quantum theory changes things, it's unlikely that philosophers or scientists will ever universally agree that there are incontrovertible proofs of God. The proofs of Aquinas, however, work for many. For me, it's more experiential and sort of like the fifth proof that he's given, the argument from design. The fact that I have a body that I did nothing to create, that I live in a world of such intricate complexity, beauty, and balance that no human could ever conceive or fashion, that I have a consciousness that allows me to see this and urges me to share the wonders I see, and that I feel drawn toward the sublime. All this tells me that there must be some directing intelligence behind it all that wants to be known and loved. Here's what Aquinas said about what we can know of God. Following philosophic assertions that trace back to Plato's Parmenides and Plotinus's Aeneids and echoed by the great Muslim philosophers, Aquinas held that nothing can be said about the necessary cause of all, the one, save that it is. Aquinas wrote, "Once it is grasped that something exists, it remains to be investigated how it exists, with what qualities, in order that what it is may be known by its qualities. But because it is not possible for us to know what God is, but rather what God is not, we cannot consider how God exists, but rather how God does not exist." If this is true, it's good to ask, how can we say that God is good? Aquinas argued that the word good, when applied to God, has a different meaning from what it means to us. He wrote, "When we say God is good, the sense is not that God is the cause of goodness or that God is not bad. Rather, the sense is that what we call good in creatures pre-exist in God, albeit in a higher mode." In short, his argument is that we cannot know God's goodness directly, as what we know as goodness is only relevant to us. God's pre-existent goodness is higher and beyond us, though we can reason that it must exist. As you've seen, we've seen this argument before, that God cannot be directly known. It's in the Quran, where it says, for example, nothing is like God and that our knowledge cannot grasp him. It's in Ibn Sina's writings, who taught that God cannot be an essence, as it has no qualities, and from Al-Ghazali, who taught that only the prophets of God really know God. Aquinas agrees and notes that our belief in God's goodness is solely based on what we know of goodness in our world, which we then attribute to God. This seems to me a reasonable way to reconcile a belief that God's essence is unknowable with what we believe are God's attributes. As with Al-Ghazali, Maimonides, and many others, Aquinas concluded that it is not possible to prove by demonstrable proofs that the universe had a beginning in time, or that it was eternal. For all we can tell, Aquinas observed, God could have created the world in such a way that it had always existed. Aquinas reasoned that space and time were products of creation. Without creation, there could be neither space nor time. He reasoned as such. The existence of three-dimensional bodies proves that there is space, but if there were no created bodies, there would be no space. Space is dependent on three-dimensional bodies. As there are three-dimensional bodies, space must, he reasoned, have been created. And following Aristotle again, Aquinas thought that as time is the measure of motion, without motion there is no time. Time is dependent on motion. Thus, time began with the movement of the bodies that started at creation. Even though God must be outside of space and time, like Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali, but not Ibn Rushd, Aquinas held that God is present to every time or instant of time, and must be so, because a thing's existence cannot remain after the cessation of the action of the agent causing the effect. Agreeing with Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, Aquinas held that everything must have an ongoing cause to maintain its existence. While he reasoned that it cannot be proved, like al-Ghazali and al-Kindi, Aquinas believed that God created the world out of nothing, something, he reasoned, only God could do. Everything else in the natural world, he taught, comes into existence by modifying what is already here. Reflecting Plato, Aristotle, and Ibn Rushd, Aquinas held that the whole universe with its individual parts is ordered to God as its end, inasmuch as by a kind of imitation the universe represents divine goodness for the glory of God. And, reflecting Plato, Aquinas reasoned that God intends only to share his perfection, which is his goodness. The purpose of creation, therefore, is to reflect God's goodness and glory. Following Aristotle, Aquinas taught that there were three basic entities: prime matter, substantial forms, and accidental forms. Material substances, the things we see, are composites of form and matter. Prime matter, also called primary substance, is simply the material that things are made of. To Aristotle and Aquinas, it's a potential which can be shaped or realized. Substantial form is the internal organizing principle that gives a thing its nature. It actuates matter, organizing its parts. It's what assembles and makes, for example, a rock, a plant, a cat, or a person. A substantial form individuates matter into a whole and accounts for its parts and processes. Substantial forms are irreducible. Their parts cannot be removed without destroying the whole. In modern terms, substantial forms are like the genetic guides that assemble things in a particular fashion. No universal forms exist except in the abstract. If a substantial form is killed or undergoes substantial change, its parts, Aquinas held, revert to the most basic material substratum, prime matter, which eventually lacks form. An accidental form is a quality or property that is variable or non-essential in a substantial form. The color of a tree, for example. Some also consider it a form without an inherent internal organizing principle. A car, for example, has no inherent organizing principle. Aquinas argued that forms, substantial and accidental, do not themselves exist, but because it is by them that something exists. Following Aristotle's De Anima, Aquinas considered soul as the first principle of life, the substantial form of living things. Thus, plants, animals, and humans each have a soul, though each has a distinct substantial form. Recall that a substantial form is the internal organizing principle that makes a thing into what it is designed to be. Aquinas thought that the human soul is the substantial form of the human body and an incorporeal and subsistent principle. Further, he argued that it is incorruptible, by which he meant that it cannot go out of existence. Again, following Aristotle, Aquinas held that the soul's powers, being potentialities, are distinct from and must flow out of a soul's essence, which is an actuality. Aquinas also thought that our souls will not be separated from their bodies forever, and that in the fullness of time on the day of judgment they will be reunited with their resurrected bodies. Aquinas followed Aristotle in supposing that human choices are ordered toward a single ultimate end. Aquinas wrote, "There must be some ultimate end on account of which all other things are desired, whereas this end itself is not desired on account of anything else." Like Aristotle, he felt that this ultimate end is happiness, eudaimonia, obtained by intellectual contemplation in nothing other than the vision of the divine essence. Our ordering of major philosophers and sages of the Abrahamic persuasion by the times in which they lived now brings us to Hafez. Hafez is an honorary title given to one who has mastered the whole Quran, a feat Hafez accomplished while young. He also apparently memorized much of the writings of Rumi and Attar. Little is known about Hafez other than his writing. His birth date is uncertain, but was likely around 1320 in Shiraz. He is the most well-known poet of Iran. Hafez seems to have grown up in a working-class family which experienced poverty when his father, a coal merchant, died. Early on, Hafez worked in a drapery shop and then a bakery. In his 20s, he became a poet in the court of Abu Ishaq Inju, the ruler of Shiraz, and later he became a teacher of Quranic studies. His fortunes ebbed and flowed depending on who was ruling Shiraz. At about age 50, he was forced to flee Shiraz and settled in Isfahan for a few years until the political climate allowed him to return to Shiraz. At age 60, he undertook a 40-day and night vigil to attain spiritual union with his Creator. He drew a circle and sat in the middle of it until he could attain this mystical union, which he achieved on the 40th day. Much of his poetry was written after this. Hafez was a master of a style of poetry called the ghazal, love poems of 6 to 15 couplets that express the freedom of religious ecstasy, the pain of separation, and the beauty of love, even with its pain and sorrow. While often guised as poems about romantic love and the abandonment found in inebriation, Hafez's poems are generally understood as expressions of his love for God. Hafez died at about age 69 in 1388 or early 1389. Here's a poem by Hafez. Stop being so religious. What do sad people have in common? It seems they have all built a shrine to the past, and often they go there and do a strange wail and worship. What is the beginning of happiness? It is to stop being so religious like that. Here's his poem, Tired of Speaking Sweetly. I really like this one. Love wants to reach out and manhandle us, break all our teacup talk of God. If you had the courage and could give the beloved his choice some nights, he would just drag you around the room by your hair, ripping from your grip all those toys in the world that bring you no joy. Love sometimes gets tired of speaking sweetly and wants to rip to shreds all your erroneous notions of truth that make you fight within yourself, dear one, and with others, causing the world to weep on too many fine days. God wants to manhandle us, lock us inside of a tiny room with himself, and practice his drop kick. The beloved sometimes wants to do us a great favor, hold us upside down and shake all the nonsense out. But when we hear he is in such a playful, drunken mood, most everyone I know quickly packs their bags and hightails it out of town. Here's his I have learned so much, which I think is so important in its message. I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, a woman, an angel, or even a pure soul. Love has befriended Hafez so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image my mind has ever known. And this is his potted plant poem. I pull a sun from my coin purse every day, and at night I let my pet, the moon, run freely into the sky meadow. If I whistled, she would turn her head and look at me. If I then waved my arms, she would come back wagging a marvelous tail of stars. There are always a few men like me in this world who are house-sitting for God. We share his royal duties. I water each day a favorite potted plant of his, this earth. Ask the friend for love. Ask him again, for I have learned that every heart will get what it prays for most. As we've seen, the Abrahamic sages and philosophers of the Middle Ages greatly extended Greek thought on the nature of God, reality, and salvation. They reintroduced the rigors of logic, discovered its limits, and tested its metaphysical proofs. They wrestled with the subtleties of language and translation and clarified what must be true of God, humans, and nature. In doing so, they laid the foundations for modern philosophy. Some of the poets of the Middle Ages also excelled in their understanding of metaphysical space, inviting us in and sharing with us its rich and eternal contours. Next, we'll look at some of the Middle Ages sages and saints from the East, those who extended debate and knowledge about reality and the divine.